Thank you very much. Next up, we have Ms. Khalid. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I find it very interesting how hard the Conservatives are trying to tie this to a minister when we have heard time and time again from so many different department officials that there was no minister that was linked to this. So I'll leave that there, and I also wonder how much money the Conservatives have spent calling in committee meetings to find out and how they can scramble to link this to a minister, to link this to some kind of big conspiracy, which clearly they're not finding. I wonder how many millions of dollars they're going to spend just to try to get their political points in. But I do also want to express how disappointed I was when I read the Auditor General's report. I don't want to see the lack of transparency within the public service, because I believe the thousands and thousands of people that are in the public service do really good work. And when things like this happen, it really impacts that whole trust within our public service, who we rely on a day-to-day basis in getting that work done. So perhaps I'll start by going back to the situation in 2020. And Ms. Reza, perhaps you can help us in understanding what was going on in procurement in 2020 and how did it differ from 2019?
Thank you very much for the question. It differed pretty significantly and radically. We doubled the contract value that we did in a year with the same amount of staff, and we did it in a position where, in mid-March we were negotiating services, and all of a sudden we were responsible for buying PPE for Canada, not just at the federal level, but to help the provinces and territories. And buying PPE for Canada, that was not for the faint of heart. I was front and center in that, working night and day with many other people who are working night and day, trying to build a supply chain that was able to pivot around the world to be able to support the needs of Canadians, of hospitals. I mean, it was pretty incredibly intense. And every department coming, trying to seek the authorities they needed to be able to deliver critical services to Canadians. Add in vaccine procurement in a globally competitive environment, add in trying to have call centers, getting freezers to keep vaccines, trying to work with a workforce that was exhausted, sick, trying to deliver services for Canadian society. It was a pretty intense period of time where a tremendous amount of work went on. And I think that I heard in your question that, the work that the public service is doing, this current situation that we're facing in procurement is shattering. And I think that, I've heard both the AG and the Controller General of Canada caution that not more rules are required. But as you heard my colleague indicate, we've already started to put in new rules. And we've started to enforce and do what we can to increase our due diligence. So it's going to be a very difficult way forward based on a year or 2 years of pandemic readiness in terms of PPE, vents, many different commodities that had to be built and a supply chain created where there was none before. So it's certainly a very difficult period. Thank you.
Thank you. And, taxpayer dollars mean a lot. They mean a lot to me. They mean a lot to my colleagues, to every single member in this House, and how we use them. Now, as you're going forward in fixing a lot of these mistakes that have happened on this specific contracting, is there a way to get taxpayer dollars back? When are you able to do something about it?
Thank you very much for the question. The Government of Canada has different levers that it can use for restitution. We are in the process we are in midst consultation with our legal services to see what we can do across an array of measures. Thank you.
Thank you. And can you also kind of compare? So, during COVID, you spoke about this. There were so many contracts going on, whether it was for N95 masks or vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. Did we see similar procurement practices in all of these other contract negotiations as well?
Thank you very much for the question. No, we did not. And I want to add something that I think is also very pertinent to the conversation. Because in 2020, it was such a difficult, turbulent time where so many things were happening, we actually took an unprecedented measure of sending out a conflict of interest form to all procurement officers and all senior officials at the PSPC, asking them if they had any conflicts of interest with the firms that we were doing business with. We did that, I think, 2 or 3 times in 2020, and we have 1,000 COIs on record, and we actually asked them, because at that time, Dalian, GC Strategies, and Coradics were in the mix of companies that we were doing business with for this CBSA application, and we received nil responses.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est M. Lemire encore pour 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. How is it that the department in charge of procurement wasn't aware of contracts awarded by various departments that it's supposed to offer advice to? There's something that fascinates me here. How is it that GC Strategies could rack up contracts at the same time as having only 2 people under their employ? Is there a sense of panic in the department when it comes to awarding those contracts without a proper verification process of the whole broad issue? That's a very interesting question. As I said earlier, there's only a small number of contracts that are awarded on this basis. Most contracts are awarded by departments and themselves, and the onus is on them to engage in proactive disclosure, and that is a responsibility under the Treasury Board Secretariat's directives. Well, it's important for GC Strategies for us to remember this isn't a company that came out of nowhere. It had qualified and was pre-qualified under the supply arrangements and had met a certain number of criteria in terms of its financial capacity, its previous experience. So they didn't just come out of the blue or out of left field. They had a history, a track record of previous contracts. So I'm not trying to defend the company, but I just want to put all of this in context, in the proper context. So I just wanted to bring that point to the table concerning GC Strategies. Well, given the context, ArriveCan had to be developed. How is it the big players in IT didn't bid in this process? How is that possible? Response. Well, I'd like to refer back to a comment I made early in the meeting. The CBSA identified only one single supplier that had the capacity to help them. They had the requisite experience to prepare a new app of this kind. And the second point I'd like to make is this. There's competitive procurement and non-competitive procurement. There were other suppliers that reported an interest, but they decided not to bid. Thank you.
Suivant, next up is MP Idlout. You have the floor again for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. The Deputy Minister's response earlier indicates to me that she has received guidance about the importance of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, including in procurement. So my next questions will be to seek whether that reaches measures in subcontracting. Mr. Yao has claimed to be very busy finding vendors in order to fulfill the contract he received. So my first question is, what is the process to ensure benefits are still delivered to Indigenous peoples when contracts are awarded to Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs that intend to subcontract those services?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask my head of procurement to respond.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. President. I would say that an excellent question that is being raised. This question would have, unfortunately, to be directed to Indigenous Service Canada. They're the one basically responsible to establish the criteria in terms of, I know that there's a 51% ownership requirement in terms of, making sure that there are economic implications for the communities. This is something also that is within their purview, so I wouldn't want to comment on their behalf.
What kind of arrangement do you have with Indigenous Services Canada to make sure that those measures are being followed?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. So Mr. Chair, we are in touch with them. I know that they're actively looking into this. They're looking at the Indigenous Business Directory. Maybe they're reviewing some of the rules. So I know that they're basically quite seized with the question these days.
And if I could add, we also do Indigenous benefit reports in various fields. So, for example, here on Parliament Hill for the construction we're doing, we have a report on this area as well as in defense procurement. So we try to capture it in various elements and make it accessible and make it known what our expectations are.
Thank you. Probably my last question. Could you provide the details of how Dilian followed the process to ensure that some contracts were awarded to other Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs?
Thank you very much. We'll take that we'll take that question and provide it to the Indigenous Services Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Going now to MP Barrett. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I want to pick up where we were before. 635, what was the term that you used for them, Deputy Minister?
Companies, they're the professional services providers, TBIP.
Professional services providers, okay. So these 635 companies are not executing on the actual work, as you detailed in the questions from my colleague. They're middlemen, so they're middlemen. They're not executing on it. They're just finding resources and providing them. The Auditor General found that one of them, GC Strategies, wrote an RFP for the government, effectively to the exclusion of anyone else, but their own company. Is that common practice?
No, it is not.
How many other occurrences of that are there in the Government of Canada?
Thank you for the question. First, when we saw this in the AG's report, we also immediately picked up the phone to talk to the Auditor General because we were obviously unaware. We have since referred the matter to the RCMP as well. I know that seems to be the door that goes to, but we take these matters very seriously. When bid material is being prepared, as was discussed yesterday in the committee, there's an attestation that says, have you been involved in this? Because it precludes you from bidding on the work. So there's a lot of bells and whistles that are required. And in terms of your exact question, I'm going to ask Catherine, who has a responsibility in security, to advise us if you have any information on data.
So I'd like to offer a precision on my question before you respond. 635 companies. The Auditor General looked at one program and found one of the contractors was doing this. How many other companies do you suspect have engaged in this, and are you certain that there are no other occurrences of these middlemen writing their own contracts?
Thank you very much for the question. We can't be certain. What we do is we spend time looking at fraud, detection, data mining, and constantly auditing the various elements of it. Catherine?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairperson. So we do have a preventative and detection and early response framework to certain allegations that are brought before us. So as soon as there is an allegation, we look closely to see if there is documentation to support the allegation. Then we conduct an analysis to determine if there's evidence to substantiate the allegations. Now, if we arrive at that stage, we then refer the file to the internal investigative branch of the department so that they can move forward with the formal investigation of those allegations that have been laid. If we find criminal intent or action, we refer this file onto the RCMP.
Thank you very much. I will